Hey free-to-play gang, welcome back to another video. So today we are going to talk a little bit more. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to come to this page. Sorry for the casual flex. So today we are going to talk a little bit more about some of the espers that you guys have requested pertaining to their resonances. So we can go ahead and take a look at some epic espers because that is something that a lot of you guys have requested. And I understand why that's the case, because it's a lot easier to at least fully resolve some of the epic espers, right? So we're going to start off with not Joser, okay? We're going to start off with Chloe for today's video. And we are also going to talk about Heng Yue, and then we are going to talk about Suhua. So we are going to spread it out a little bit, talk about some epic espers, talk about some rare espers. Moving forward, I want to just spread it out into one legendary, one epic, and one rare esper so that we at least cover everything that needs to be covered rather smoothly and we do not forego certain rarities and all that. Because I think it's still quite important to talk about some of the legendary espers. So let's take a look at Chloe, and I've actually removed all of the resonance points because I'll talk about some of the worthy mentions first. So the first worthy mention is probably going to be Deathly Cinders. And now the reason why I say Deathly Cinders is a worthy mention is because if you're using Chloe for PvP, there is a very strong chance that if you do not cleave the enemy at the start, what happens is your Chloe is actually going to be one of the last standing espers because she's probably going to steal a whole bunch of buffs, right? She's probably going to steal shield buffs, steal all the defense buffs, steal a lot of the stuff, right? And possibly even invincibility as well, which means that she's going to be one of the last standing espers on your team. And if that's the case, when your allies die, your crit damage goes up by 8%, upwards of 32% in point 1, for example, right? So if you're going to be building her with the Hades relic set, then I think this has a lot of value. Well, at least before your heals go down to 0, I think that could be still quite powerful, and this is definitely going to be a tide changer in my opinion. Another worthy mention is probably going to be Perfect Harvest as well. So the reason why this works, and I've talked about this before, but even for multi-hit attacks, as long as the total damage, right, not just one single damage number over there, as long as the total damage is more than 35% of the target's max HP, you will then deal an additional true damage equal to 5% of the target's max HP, and it will not stack multiple times. Which means that if you hit 5 times, you're only going to have an additional 5% of the target's max HP. But this is also pretty good because this is going to give you a little bit more damaging power, especially against some of the tankier espers. So it is not bad. And the third and final worthy mention is probably going to be Pressure Vitals. So the thing is, this requires quite an extensive investment into Pressure Vitals, but I don't think it's going to be all that bad. Now hear me out. So upon successfully dispelling or stealing a buff, each buff grants the target max HP minus 3% up to minus 15% per target per turn. So the thing is, if you're going to be stealing a whole ton of buffs, especially with your third skill and your first skill as well, you're going to be chopping off the max HP of these enemies as well. So the thing is, if you're going to steal buffs from let's say Gabrielle's buffs, you're going to be reducing their max HP by 6% for every successful complete steal that you do. Which means that you're also dealing an additional true damage worth 6% of their max HP. And the thing is, this goes up with the number of buffs that you steal as well. So Chloe is kind of like a pressure esper. So she's going to apply a lot of force towards the later part of the fight, which means that this is actually pretty good. And the reason why I say that this is probably not so bad of an investment is because the path that you can take, number 1, targeted constraints, which increases your accuracy as well, which allows her to steal buffs. Okay, you need accuracy to steal buffs. And next, Crisis Response. If your HP falls below 50%, this would also increase your own damage output, which, like I said, Chloe is one of those espers that stays on towards the end of the fight, right? So this is actually quite useful. And then finally, Pressure Vital. So it's not as if this path is not good at all. This path is not bad. Oh, and I guess this translates on as well. So Berserker Drain. This might make sense as well for Chloe. So there are a lot of nodes over here that work very well for Chloe, which is quite rare. You don't really see an esper that benefits so much from so many different resonance points over here, or rather the resonance talents. So this is the way that I would use my Chloe, and this is probably one of the most cookie cutter methods as well. So number 1, you want to have a little bit more accuracy because most of the time players will not be building their espers with resistance, which means that this is going to be very effective. Unless you're talking about PvE content. If it's PvE content, this might not even matter as much. Next, one very important one is going to be Life Snatcher. I don't really talk too much about Life Snatcher, but it really fits the theme of Chloe. So when an enemy dies, your basic attack increases by 5%. This is huge, especially for espers like Gaius, especially for espers like obviously Chloe. So you're going to be taking out espers with your third skill, and when you do so, your damage is just going to increase, and that's going to further the damage output of your next attack onwards and onwards, right? And then obviously extra crit rate is definitely good, and if the enemy's HP is below 50%, your damage output increases by 3%. And finally, your first hit, which is most of the time going to be a third skill, is going to deal an additional damage, which will then allow you to acquire Life Snatcher a little bit more efficiently. So this is just the most cookie cutter approach to Chloe, and I think this is going to work very well for most content in the game. So this is also something that I will highly recommend. But then again, like I said, there are some of those other special mentions that depending on how you want to play the game, depending on how you want to build her, maybe as a hybrid, maybe as like a bruiser or something like that, this could work as well. I mean, there are many different ways to play with her. Maybe just before we end off the chapter on Chloe, let's take a look at her fashion sense over here, right? Perform single target attacks 5 times, and each of these hits steals 2 buffs, which means you can steal up to 10 buffs. This is very powerful. And obviously each buff increases the damage that she does, which means that the more buffs she steals, the more damage she does, and thus allows her to guarantee a kill much easier. And also her first skill here, right? Attacks an enemy twice, each hit has a 50% chance of stealing 1 buff. Now let's move on to Heng Yue here. So let's take a look at her resonance for a little bit. So this is going to be quite straightforward. We're just going to dump everything into HP. Now this is not a fixed path at all. Okay, so for example, Life Flux, you may not necessarily need Life Flux, right? If the target's HP is below 40%, target's healing received plus 5%, this is not necessarily that important, or rather maybe this might not be that important as well when granting a buff because she has buffs on her passive. You might want to consider targeted constraints as well because you need a little bit of accuracy for your buff stripping. And the thing is, with Pressure Vitals, your Heng Yue suddenly becomes a little bit more offensive. She carries a little bit more damage output. So for example, right, she can actually start reducing the enemy's max HP whenever she uses her normal attack, which is huge, especially if you're running her with Astral Witchcraft. If you're going to be running her with Astral Witchcraft like how I am doing so, she's going to take a lot of turns, and most of those turns are going to be her normal attacks. With that, you have a good chance of not only stealing buffs, but also dealing more damage, which I think allows her to be more effective than what she were previously. And obviously this is going to be pretty good. If HP is below 50% or allies damage plus 2%, I mean, it's pretty good for supports in general. And then obviously hasty action for a little bit more turn cycling, which means a little bit more healing, which means a little bit more buff stripping, which means a little bit more damage. So I think this is a pretty good way to start her build. And here we can take a look at her passive real quick, right? So as you can see, at the end of her turn, you heal the ally with the lowest HP percentage, blah blah blah, and if the ally's HP is below 50%, you then grant a recovery buff for 2 turns. And her first skill here attacks one enemy with a 100% chance of dispelling 1 buff from the enemy. This is huge. So let's move on with the final Esper for today's video, and that's going to be Suhua, because a lot of you guys probably have her at R6 right now. So please take note that rare Espers only have 4 chances to upgrade their talents, which is a huge setback as opposed to legendaries and of course epics as well, who have 6 and 5 talents respectively. So let's start with the first rare Esper, Suhua here. These are going to be the talents that I think work the best for her, and this is obviously just my opinion, right? But it's going to be very clear why this is the case. So number 1, Life Flux. If your ally has below 40% HP, her second skill is going to be a little bit more powerful in terms of the healing that your ally will receive, which is pretty decent sometimes. And this targeted constraints, I like to use this on her because I use her not just for her buffs, not just for her healing, but also for her attack debuff. So her first skill over here, she has attack debuff on her kit. And the thing is, my accuracy is only at 72%, and that's not enough because 80% is the soft cap, which means that you should need another 8% accuracy, but because it is generally quite difficult to find accuracy subs when you really need it, so I think this is a great way for you to compensate and get the additional accuracy subs that you may be lacking in. So this is mostly going to be 6 to 10% depending on the content. And then next we have Crisis Response, very typical, and of course Hasty Action, which I think works really well for her. But honestly, apart from these notes, there are some other notes here that make a little bit of sense as well. So number 1, the Wind Guardian, immobilize ally speed plus 5 up to plus 15. This is not so bad, especially if you're up against enemies who have the potential to stun your team. If that's the case, land like freezers and all that, your ally speed will then increase by a little bit, which is quite nice sometimes. And furthermore, this note over here, Force Field, debuffed allies resistance plus 5% up to 15%. This is not bad as well. This is really quite good. So that's about it for Suhua. Let's take a look at her second skill here, right? So it grants an invincibility buff and recovery buff for 1 turn. And the ally's HP is below 50%, you grant extra recovery. So there's a lot of buffs here, right? Number 1, there's a lot of buffs here. And heals 1 ally based on their max HP. So actually, honestly, just because she has 3 buffs in 1 skill, this might make sense as well if you want to make sure that Suhua has her HP kept up. But the thing is, she only has 4 talents, and it's going to be very difficult for me to, like, let's say, justify removing Life Flux in exchange for having more self-healing. I think healing your ally takes priority, for example. But then again, it really depends on how you want to build her. You may not even need Hasty Action if you don't really care too much about the speed. But I guess that's it for this video. I can end over here. These are the 3 Espers that I want to talk about for today's video. So we had Chloe, we had Heng Yue, and we had Suhua. So who else would you like to see in the next video? Leave the comment down below and I'll get back to you. Well, hopefully in a video coming really soon. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up, it really helps the channel, and subscribe for more Dislyte content. Now with that said, this has been Daddy Free to Play, and as always, I will see you in the next video.